Welcome back. Well, we've just heard from the Environment Commissioner, Dr Jan Wright, who believes the government's ETS bill will cost New Zealand in the future. Let's bring in our panel now. John Carnegie from Business New Zealand, Dr William Rolleston of Federated Farmers and Dr Kennedy Graham from the Green Party. Welcome to you all this morning. If I could start with you, Kennedy Graham. Tim Grosser says that we shouldn't put our premier export industry at risk and disadvantage it when no one else in the world is doing so. So what's your argument for why we should do that? And I'm talking about here agriculture.
Pretty much everybody in the world is working hard now on every sector. That includes agriculture. Some countries have actually reduced their agricultural emissions. Sweden, for example, reduced it by 10%, Ireland by 7%. New Zealand's agricultural emissions have grown by 16%. The challenge is not to make our agricultural sector vulnerable, it's to stimulate the agriculture sector to turn into a green, high-tech sector that competes properly but reduces emissions.
Dr Rolleston, agriculture is responsible for about 50% of this country's greenhouse emissions. Why should it be taxpayer subsidised?
Well, the first thing I would say is that agriculture is already paying for emissions through energy and fuel. But I think there are very good reasons for agriculture in New Zealand not to be brought into the ETS, and we've always said there are two things that need to happen. Firstly, we need to have scalable and practical means to reduce emissions, and secondly, our competitors need to be doing the same thing. There seems to be no point when we actually have a very low carbon production in New Zealand, and actually our emissions per unit have gone down 1.8% for the last 20 years every year. So we're actually doing very well on that score. There's no point in putting a tax on agriculture and having that production move away to higher carbon producing
economies. But you kind of need to
economies.
incentivise as well at the same time, don't you? And we've talked about phasing in this scheme rather than just, you know, in 2015 going, boom, you're part of the ETS now.
There are plenty of incentives, and the incentive is around the market. If the market wants us to reduce greenhouse gases, then that is one way of doing it. But productivity is the main driver, and our productivity has been going up.
Really? You know, isn't money though, really? I mean, if you're going to get pinged and have to pay a cost, doesn't that make you bring down your emissions?
No, what it does is it drives production offshore. And if we're trying to deal with greenhouse emissions on a global scale, if you drive emissions or production to other economies who are actually producing more per unit, more carbon per unit, then you're actually doing exactly the wrong thing. If you run that argument, you should actually be incentivising farmers to produce more.
OK, John Carnegie, you say that the government has taken I think the quote was a reasonably balanced approach there. Has it, or is it just actually appealing to its voter base?
No, I think it is a balanced and measured approach, and I think I have to say the argument about businesses being subsidised is a complete furphy. I mean, I think the way that the scheme works out is that essentially in agreeing to meet our 1990 level of emissions, the UN essentially gave New Zealand a bunch of free units, which the government, although it's more complicated than this, the government hands out to business for free and gets given back. But in fact, the way that the scheme works out is that business is giving government more than the units it gives out in the first place. So, and we're going to meet our 1990 level of it.
Dr Jan Wright suggests that we all need to kind of take it on the chin a little bit, that actually some jobs may go, it may create more jobs at the same time, but that as a country we have sort of an obligation here.
Well, yes, we do have an obligation under the Kyoto Protocol, but the issue is how much New Zealand should be doing relative to everybody else. And actually, I think we underplay what we do. I think we're doing, you know, given that there are only two other schemes in the world, so out of 190 odd countries, I think we're doing OK.
Are we doing OK, Kennedy Graham?
No. You can be a world leader, you can be a fast follower, you can be an apathetic spectator, you can be a willful obstructionist. We're somewhere in the middle there.
Right.
This government consciously tries to look around and calibrate its policy in terms of what other OECD countries are doing and get in the middle of the pack. All of this is in the context of inadequate global action. We've got to put this in the context of what's going on around the world. The polar ice cap is melting about half a century before scientists anticipated it to happen.
OK, well, the Greens could find themselves potentially in government with Labour in 2014. That's, a feasible option. If that was to be the case, you would inherit the scheme with its amendments. What would you do with it?
You have a choice. You can bring back in the idea of a carbon tax and phase it in a way that doesn't have farmers running for cover and screaming, although in the 1980s, incidentally, the farmers reacted extremely well to shock therapy. But you could have a carbon tax that brings in behavioural modification and change over a phased period. Or you look at the emissions trading scheme, recognise it for what it is at the moment, which is a meaningless voucher system to pollute, and you strengthen it through the market system to a way where it really does engage in that behaviour modification, but not only emissions trading scheme, but also complementary measures in addition to the trading scheme. OK,
Dr Rolleston, I think farmers called this carbon tax in the last time that it was suggested the so-called fart tax. What would farmers prefer, an ETS scheme or a carbon tax? What would be the preference?
Well, neither. What we would prefer is to be exposed to the market.
If you had to achieve one, though, if you had to go with one.
What I think will make a difference is to be exposed to the market. And well,
what do you mean by that,
Kennedy talked about a shock therapy in the 1980s. The shock therapy in the 1980s was about reducing policy that distorted the market signals. And either a tax or an ETS is actually putting in distortions to market signals. We need to respond to our market. So measures like a carbon footprint would be a market signal that we would respond to. But I would also say that farmers in New Zealand and the New Zealand government are actually doing a lot in this area with research, and it's actually research and development that's going to make it.
Developers might be, but farmers. I mean, it sounds to me, and with the greatest respect, that what you're saying is that really farmers aren't prepared to do anything. There might be some science and research going on behind the scenes as to how we can bring down methane levels, but really farmers aren't prepared to move on this.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you're actually sending the wrong signals. And I come back to a point I made earlier. If New Zealand has one of the lowest carbon-producing agricultural sectors in the world. For every unit that we of product that we produce, we have a much lower amount of carbon that we produce. If you start putting taxes or trading schemes and disincentivise farmers, make it more expensive, we can't compete in the world, and that production will go offshore. That will create a net increase in carbon across the world. That is not trying to solve the problem that the environmentalists want us to solve.
John Carnegie, the message that we're getting is that business doesn't have a great deal of interest in paying their way. This is the wrong time or the wrong environment. When, though, is a business going to say, actually, it's a good time to incur a few more costs, let's start now? That's not going to happen, is it?
Well, no, the issue is that businesses are now facing a cost of carbon, and they have been since, in terms of liquid fossil fuels in the electricity sector, since 2010. The problem that we're hearing is that people are just complaining now that the market is delivering a low price of carbon. We weren't hearing these complaints April last year when the price of carbon was $20. So this is what we've got: a market, we've got a good system. We're having industry incentivised to actually reduce their energy use and look for better alternatives. All of that is going on. We have some of the most carbon-intensive, efficient businesses in the world in New Zealand. So the issue really is whether we're trying to use the ETS to solve the world's problems. And clearly we can't, given we're only 0.2% of world emissions.
What if quotas were imposed so that you could only buy your carbon credits from here?
Well, then, let's be honest about that conversation. All that is about how high a price of carbon do you want in New Zealand, and then it's do you want a European price or an Australian price, or actually a price that works for New Zealand?
Shouldn't we have a global price, perhaps?
I think we should, but you don't get a global price with two schemes. You need a global price. You need multiple jurisdictions all pricing carbon, either via a tax or a trading scheme. It doesn't really matter, but you don't get that. In the absence of more schemes, all you get is a significant risk, as William just talked about, of carbon leakage, of businesses going offshore. I've had a business tell me that they would actually be better off under the Australian carbon scheme. Now, that's not the outcome that we want, particularly when manufacturing here is facing such severe headwinds.
OK, Kennedy Graham, what conclusions can we draw from all of this?
That's good to hear, because the Australian price is currently $23 and ours is somewhere between $4 and $4.50 or something like that. So the sooner we get an international price that's meaningful, the better it will be. John, with respect, talks about New Zealand's emissions 0.2%. New Zealand's population is 0.06%. So per capita, we are emitting 3 to 4 times higher than we should be. And we are way above the global average, and we are way above what is required in terms of per capita emissions to what is required to bring it down. We need to peak New Zealand's gross emissions sometime in the next 5 years. The Minister was unable to even identify what year he thought peak emissions would occur. So we've got a long way to go. And in terms of suggesting that industry is already taking on a major burden, Jan Wright, I think, just cleared that one up. It was 1/20th of the total obligation.
All right, we have to leave it there. Dr. Kennedy Graham, appreciate your time. Also, Dr. William Rolleston and John Carnegie, thank you all for your input this morning. Thanks.